being played out big time right now. To the left of Mr. Obama, best example, pick up today's New York Times. Mr. Paul Krugman has his usual, in the back there on the editorial op-ed page or whatever it is. There you'll see him from the left pushing Obama, because what you're doing is not, he says to Obama, you're not doing enough government intervention, and this system is going down because you're not acting enough. From the right, Mr. Obama is pummeled, not just by Republicans, by them for sure, but also by a considerable number of Democrats, particular senators, saying it's too much, the government isn't, we shouldn't, we can't. Just like Roosevelt before him has to work out which way he's going to go. And it's not clear. It's getting clearer, but it's not quite clear which way he's going to go. So this is happening right now, and this has been going on just as capitalism oscillates back and forth. Every time there's a crisis, this argument begins. Typically, one side of the argument wins and the other one loses. When the people who say there must be intervention win, the state comes in. Over the last 6 months, those people have won. So the government has come in big time to save the situation. A year ago, there were almost as many people, not as many, but almost as many calling for the government to come in, but they weren't strong enough yet. Things hadn't gotten bad enough yet. So a year from today, the voices, Mr. Krugman looked all alone and wasn't as hard about this issue as he is today. And he wasn't listened to. And he was upset about it. That's why he was a big supporter of Obama, because he hoped that Obama would go much further in that direction than he ever imagined Bush would. A reasonable presumption. Most people shared that presumption, whether they agreed or disagreed. So when those folks win, who think the government should come in, it does. And when those folks lose, then the government is withdrawn, reduced, plays less of a role, pushed out. Every capitalist society, at least anyone I'm familiar with, and anyone I've ever studied, displays these oscillations. And I call one phase private capitalism and the other one state capitalism. There are a lot of other words. Some people call private capitalism neoliberalism. You'll see that often. Some people call it laissez-faire. A lot of words over time and in different circumstances have been used. But the basic idea is this. In one phase, the government's role is relatively less. Please note relatively less, because the role of the government in a capitalist economy is everywhere enormous. Right? Just remember, governments print the money. No one else does. Nothing happens without the money, and nobody else is allowed to make that money, just the government. So the idea that the government is not central to a modern capitalist monetized economy is silly. Don't get caught up in the rhetoric so much that you really think, get the government off our backs. Not possible. Right? The government does much too much. The government controls interest rates. Not 100%, but is a major influence on interest rate. That's the terms on which anybody lends money to anybody else. They print the money, they control the terms of lending. The government is, if you take all the different levels of government together, by far the largest employer. The government is an immense buyer of an enormous number of things. You may not have noticed it, but you cannot buy a battleship. Only the government can do that. Well, the government's the sole buyer. Try to think of what the power is if you're the sole buyer of whole industries. President Eisenhower was famous for worrying us about the military-industrial complex, he called it. That's because he was smart enough and honest enough as a president to say, you got a problem here. If the only buyer is the government and the profitability of major industries depends on it, they're going to get together to take care of each other's needs. And that's going to make a problem in our society. Which he was absolutely right. It always has been. Okay, so the government is a major buyer of whole industries. The government is the largest employer in the United States, therefore having an influence on wages and salaries. The government regulates everything, from insurance rates to your utility bills to airline, activities, and runs the post office, runs the major railroad. Whoa, the idea that the government is not central to our economy, and that's true of every other capitalist economy too, that's just silly. That's ideological junk, and we don't have time for that. But the argument is real in the sense that given that the government plays a big role, it can play a still bigger one or a more muted one, and that's what this fight is over. When the economy turns down, that you should keep the government out of it, versus when the economy turns down, you should bring the government in big time. Keynesians, neoclassicals, conservatives, liberals. Have they in fact oscillated back and forth? Yes. I'm going to take three countries. I could have taken any. I'm going to take three countries, and I'm going to comment on the third world a little bit and show you concretely how this has worked. We'll start with the United States. That's the country we're in. And I'm not going to deal with the 19th century, although I could. I'm just going to deal with the 20th. So till 1929, the United States was pretty much a private economic system. That is, there was the government there, yes. But the government had a limited, marginal, restrained role. When the Great Depression hit in 1929, as we've talked about that, Roosevelt changed that. And from roughly the mid-1930s to the 1970s, we had a state interventionist capitalism. Right? The government came in and took money from business, for example. Took money from businesses and said, we're taking this money from you and we're going to give it to workers when they reach 65. What? That was a thought that would have been thought of as Bolshevik wildness a year earlier. But in the depths of the Depression, that was passed. And it has been unable to be touched by anybody. Poor Mr. Bush 2 years ago tried to go after Social Security. Can't do it. That's become something Americans, even conservative Americans, don't want to discuss, let alone have taken away. So from the 30s to the 70s, you had state intervention. Then in the 1970s, we had another switch. The state interventionist capitalism hit a terrible crisis in the 1970s. For those of you who know something about the history of New York went bankrupt. It was kind of taken over by bankers and so forth for a while, and New York City went through quite a conniption in the middle 70s. And the country as a whole had one of its worst downturns since the Great Depression, 1974. And so out of that came, in the crisis of state capitalism, as it went down, the Keynesians, who had been in charge now for 30, 40 years, said, okay, we have to do something even more than we usually do. No, said the conservatives. On the contrary, the solution to this downturn is to go back to the private. And they won. They won. Reagan became president. And Reagan set about to undo all that had been done in the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s. He literally rolled back the New Deal. And he said that, so we don't have to guess about it. I mean, we would be entitled to make our own judgment anyway, but he also said it. And many of his advisors said it, made no bones about it. They felt that was necessary. And from the 70s to last year, that's what we had. And in case any of you think it, don't make the mistake, not just Republicans. Clinton did the same thing. There are debates about it. I don't want to make this all seem like it's all neat and packaged and everybody agrees. That's never true anyway. And now we're going back. Now, very quickly, remarkably quickly, from the crisis really hitting late in 2007 and into 2008, by now the state is massively moving back into controlling the United States government more than it has in a long time. We're back into the level of the Great Depression in terms of the state moving in. It's extraordinary. Not in every way. Roosevelt, after all, responded, just to give you one example of what hasn't happened yet, Roosevelt responded to the crisis of the 1930s, eventually, by saying the following: too many people are unemployed. The private sector is not providing jobs. And if the private sector cannot provide the jobs, then the public sector must do it. And he proceeded to hire millions of people. Okay, I mean, has to deal with that. We haven't done that yet. Not only haven't we done it, but just a footnote, it's not even being discussed yet. Not yet. There has to be what? I mentioned to you already last week. Something happened in the 1930s. Something was present that we don't have now. A communist party, a socialist party, and a really powerful labor movement that was on the upsurge. We have a very weak labor movement that, if anything, is on the, is that a word? Downsurge? Downsurge. It's declining. And the socialist and communist parties, are, if they're there, are so weak as to be literally off the chart. So we don't have the pressure from below yet that probably is necessary to get the government to come in. I mean, just think, even though I'm jumping ahead, the government, which is now the lender of last resort, lending to the banks when nobody else will, that concept, the government is the lender of last resort, is easily extendable to the government as the employer of last resort. Right? This is only a rhetorical question, a political question, when the one can become as naturally talked about as the other one already is. If you understand that context, then the sentence, the war is what finally got us out of the Depression, is true in the sense that we finally put all those unemployed people to work. I mean, they had jobs, either in the military or working for the military. But yes, 1945 is the cataclysm, the irony. All the war is over. The United States is on the winning side of the war. And now you demobilize is the word. You take all the people and put them out of uniform. You put them in uniform. You don't need them anymore. And they go home. And then the great fear was, we just came out of a depression that we could not get out of from 29 to 39. The war is over. The great fear, and go back and read the newspapers. You'll see that everywhere. The great fear was we would fall back into the depression, which was a rational thing. Everybody understood. The war is now over. All these people have no work to do. There's no one to shoot at. So we're going to take millions. Remember, there were millions in the army. Millions are going to come home looking for work. Plus the millions who are no longer needed to make munitions. They're going to look for work. But there is no work. What could it be? How could we do? And the great urgency of 1945, 46,